As curators of the modern web, we all have little monsters that we battle every day. If you've ever had a 10-minute conversation with me about web development, you'll know that for me, that monster is usually JavaScript. I am forever battling it. My curly quotes are in the wrong place, my object doesn't exist, or it just plain doesn't work and refuses to tell me why. But I know that I can use it to build great things. So I think we're going to have a love-hate relationship until one of us perishes. Now, as Katie mentioned, I consider myself a designer who happens to write code. So while I'll happily admit my struggles with JavaScript to anyone who's willing to listen to me, the monster I don't tend to confess to is this. I'm not actually very good with color. For years, every website I built used the same color palette: white, black, red, and sometimes, if I felt really creative, yellow. And if you look at my outfit or the contents of my suitcase or my shoe collection, you can see that I haven't branched out a great deal since. I've developed an appreciation for color over the years, mostly via painting every room and every flat I've ever owned some bold shade, but I still really struggle with getting color right for the web. My approach is often to go to a site like coolers.com and just hit the spacebar over and over until I land on a palette by chance that I like. And it's never quite right when I apply it, so I need to tweak it and tweak it and tweak it. I never really felt like I had a handle on color. All that changed when I started using style guides. And I'm going to tell you how a little bit later. But first, we're going to talk about what a style guide is and what we mean when we say living style guides. We'll talk about why a living style guide is so great and how they're going to make you better, happier, more productive designer and/or developer. And then finally, we'll talk about how to actually get started using them, what to put in them, and an overview of tools and techniques that'll come in handy. Along the way, we're going to throw in some pictures of zombies because it's morning and I want to make sure that everybody's still awake. So a style guide, at its core, is a set of standards for the writing and design of documents. And you've probably seen one before. There are style guides for all forms of writing, for journalism, for academic writing, for government, for law, for scientific writing. And of course, there are style guides for graphic design. Now, these are really common to traditional print and branding, but they're still sort of new to the web. Traditionally, you'd have a style guide that was laid out in a page layout program, like Quark or InDesign. And they're often really well designed themselves, but because they're printed, they're totally static. They don't change very much or very often, and all changes need to be made in a totally manual way. But on the web, our design systems change and adapt constantly. And so an out-of-date or stale style guide can often be worse than none at all. So what we need is a style guide that updates continuously as we iterate on our design. And when we talk about a living style guide, that just means that it's constantly being updated. And ideally, that happens as automatically as possible, because human beings are terrible at remembering to update the documentation, but machines are pretty good at that kind of thing. And that's where a living style guide starts to become really magical. Now, you may notice a lot of different terms being thrown around when you look into style guides. And all these terms denote slightly different things, and there's lots of overlap between them. But let's not get bogged down in terminology here. We're going to talk about style guides. And when we talk about style guides, we're just talking about design documentation. A style guide is a way to communicate and clarify your design decisions. Now, there are lots of reasons why you might want to document your design. The most notable being to improve consistency of your work. When you're working on a project for a long time or have lots of people contributing to that project, so open source projects, for example, it's really common to see a wide variety of styles that are quite similar but a little off from one another. So lots of different shades of gray that are close enough but still visually distinct, margins that are off by a few pixels, loads of different sans serif typefaces that don't really contrast that much. Nobody is immune to this problem. So this is a button on eBay's site. But I looked closer, and these are also buttons. Every single one of these buttons is slightly different. They use different colors, there's gradients on some of them, they have different shadow effects, some of them have rounded corners, font sizes change. Seeing it all on one page like this makes it seem kind of ridiculous. But this is where a living style guide can really help. Because what happened here, or what probably happened here, is that people didn't know that button styles were already available, or maybe there was a style guide, but it was static and hadn't been kept up to date when the buttons were changed. Seeing everything in one place makes it easier to spot those inconsistencies. And when you document your variables and styles and keep them up to date, people know what to use when they inevitably inherit your code. As the way we design becomes more componentized, it means that traditional mockups have less meaning, and page layout is becoming less important. So adopting a component-based or style guide-driven approach can go a long way towards speeding up your workflow. And this doesn't need to be a big paradigm shift. So you may already be using style tiles or element collages or whatever. If you just build those in HTML rather than in a graphics program, you kind of already have a style guide. And if you tie that to your build system, you end up with something that automatically updates as you update your website. This can mean a little more time to get started in the beginning, but it does lead to faster development in the long run. And your first iterations end up being truer to your final. Think of things how fonts tend to render very differently in a web browser than they do in a graphics program. It also means that you don't need to repeat yourself when you move from the design to the development stage. One of my biggest frustrations with modern web development is that I'm constantly having to switch back and forth between pages. When I change one thing on one page, it changes a thing on another page. With the Living Style Guide, you see all your elements in one place, so you can see immediately how changing a style for one affects the others. And it's this whole everything in one place thing that leads to improved testing across the board. So better accessibility testing, better visual regression testing, better device testing, better performance testing. This is a tool that I use for color contrast. It's called TOTE11Y. I basically just load my style guide in my browser, I enable the tool, and it flags any trouble spots. The trouble spots are all pink, so you can see I need to massively fix this. I'll admit to being pretty lazy about browser and device testing lately, but a living style guide makes it really easy even if you're lazy like me. You can test almost everything from one single page. And then there's performance. As more and more people access the web over a mobile device, we need to think of performance as a design problem. You can use a style guide to spell out code rules for performance, as well as set your performance budget. And you can also use it to prevent duplicating elements. Any duplicated styles or icons or fonts that you're loading add to the page weight and force the browser to work harder to load your content. When you have everything on one page, it's a lot easier to audit for these unused styles. This is an old tool called Dust.me selectors, which just scans the page and outputs all of the CSS selectors that are in your style sheet but aren't being used by your HTML. And I actually have 250 unused styles here, so I can probably go in and remove some of those. That tool is, I think, a bit out of date now, but Chrome's dev tools actually do it out of the box. If you just run a web page performance audit, it will spit out all of the CSS rules that aren't being used, and you can strip those out. Now, design documentation means that not only is every element on the same literal page, but you also have every person on the same figurative page. So I love developers. I happen to live with one. But I think that spending all day staring into a terminal leads to what I'm going to call a tragic underuse of white space. And sometimes when you're working as the developer, design can get a bit lost in translation. With a style guide, you have a piece of documentation that says these gutters should be 40 pixels wide, and that implementation is a lot clearer. So you increase the understanding and dialogue between developers and designers, so that you don't just hand off a design and abandon it. It becomes more of an iterative process. But it's not just developers that this will improve your relationship with. Spelling out styles that are available and how to use them is good for everyone, for designers, for copywriters, for content editors, and also for yourself in the future. A style guide is also an opportunity to show off a little. Many companies post them publicly, which allows for discussion and transparency. Showing a commitment to good design can help with hiring initiatives. Designers will be attracted to your organization if you can show a culture of design in much the same way that showcasing open source contributions does to attract developers. This is Buffer's style guide, and it actually links directly to their hiring page, and specifically a page for product designers. This actually 404s now, so I'm guessing their style guide isn't super alive, but it's a nice idea. The number one reason to use a living style guide is it will help you build more beautiful, more usable websites. Seeing everything in one place gives you an overarching, holistic view of how your design system works and how all the pieces fit together, making it easier to smooth out any conflicts and ensure that everything is cohesively designed. Now, style guides are super flexible. You can more or less put whatever you want in them. But there are a few things that commonly turn up. So branding is a pretty obvious place to start. Use your logo and your logo type, along with any rules for spacing, color, orientation, and where to find the file or provide a download. Include all the colors used in your palettes, hex codes and CSS variables both. Make them copyable, along with usage instructions. So use this color for links. Any rules for accessibility you can include here. So maybe you want to enforce a certain contrast ratio. You can also give your colors cute names. Yelp's style guide has a color called Yelpy Red. It's a really subtle way to enforce your brand and add personality. Include typography, headings, lists, block quotes, stuff like that. It's a good way to ensure that your type styles are really consistent. Every extra font file that you load adds to the weight of your page, and it's super easy to load weights and styles you're not using. I once audited a site and found 6 different sans serif typefaces in use, all of them very similar, Open Sans, Helvetica Arial. So don't do that. Show all of your button states, primary, secondary, and active buttons, as well as the active, hover, and focus states, and any other form elements. If you're using a grid, give a visual representation of that grid, along with any CSS variables or mix-ins you might want to use to create the grid. Include a visual representation of your icon library. Make it searchable if it's big, and include usage instructions so that it's easy for everybody who might be working on the site to pick out an icon and use it. All of the elements that make up your site should be represented in your style guide. So anything that's repeated more than once, cards, drop-downs, interactive elements, avatars, feeds, images, captions, galleries, all that stuff should turn up. You can also show animation patterns. So maybe you have some saved keyframes or Bezier curves, as well as rules for how those interactions work. So for instance, you may want to use an ease in function when an object moves into the screen and an ease out when it leaves. A motion style guide will help your interactions to feel more choreographed. You can also use a style guide to enforce other related stuff like code standards, as well as rules for copy, grammar, and tone. So for instance, do your headings use sentence case or title case? If you don't know, I recommend sentence case. It's more readable, but be consistent. Copy is integral to design, after all, and to how a site works. And tone is actually a big part of brand. Remember, whatever you put in your style guide, it's documentation. So make sure to explain everything as much as possible. Start with the what. Here's a medium blue color we use as our primary accent. Move to the how. Here's a hex code and the SAS variable. And for bonus credit, include why. We use blue because it's calming and serene, and if zombies are sleepy, they're less likely to chase us. Don't forget that you can also style the style guide itself. Style guides on the web can often be kind of boring to look at, especially when they're automatically generated. So I like to style mine to fit in a bit more with the overall feel of the site. If you think of them as an advert for all the great design you're doing, especially if you're interested in attracting more design talent, that's a good way to start. You can look to printed style guides for inspiration. So now that you know what to put in one, how do you actually go about making one? There are so many tools to make style guides. Styleguides.io currently lists 121 different tools, so choosing one is a bit of a challenge. There are a few different types of tools that you're likely to come across. So the easiest way to get started with style guides is to use something called static generators. These won't build you a living style guide, but they're pretty great if you don't want to get your hands messy with code. This is stylifyme.com. You just enter your URL and it will make you a style guide automatically. You're good to go. I'm picking on eBay again here. You can see that they really suffer for that multiple shades of gray and actually white problem. This is a really easy way to see what you currently have and assess any problems that may exist. But it's obviously not living at all, and it's limited to what it can pick out of your CSS. You can get a more in-depth static style guide by using Frontify Style Guide, which is good for a more traditional and controlled feel, sort of closer to a print style guide. But again, this is totally manual. You actually enter all those colors manually. And the danger of these sorts of tools is that it's extremely easy to let your style guide get out of date unless you're able to be super vigilant about keeping it updated. One way to get started with style guides and making living style guides is to adopt a more style guide-driven approach to your design work. So I start my projects by doing wireframes, and I usually build them in Sketch. Each individual component is a symbol, and when I'm finished with the wireframes, I have this library of symbols that all sits together. I design each of the components individually, but I see them all together in one place as I'm working on them. And when I'm finished, I have a style guide in my library and a full mock-up using those styles. Now, obviously, a sketch file isn't alive either, but you actually can bring it back from the dead. There's a tool that Airbnb built called React Sketch App, and it more or less does what it says on the tin. It exports React components back into Sketch. So if you're using React for your site, you could potentially actually have a style guide that lives entirely in Sketch. Now that's great for a complex project, but I've spent a lot of time building custom client sites in WordPress, and usually there's time and budget constraints that make this sort of thing impossible. And I realized that WordPress is actually a great tool for building wireframes. It's pretty easy to input content and then to tweak the functionality and placement in a theme in order to mimic the content and functionality of a final site. If you start your design process by building an HTML and CSS style guide inside of your site's theme, when your style guide is done, you more or less end up with a finished site. I have some starter code that I put up on GitHub. Fair warning, I haven't touched it in like 6 months. But if you want to play around with it, you are more than welcome to fork, experiment, tell me it's terrible. If you want a more official sort of like proper style guide-y tool though, you may want to look at CSS documentation parsers. There are loads of these. Common ones are sass down, style down, hologram. But the most popular is KSS or Nile style sheets. And it's basically a syntax for the comments in your CSS. So your CSS would look something like this ordinarily. And with KSS, they look something like this instead. The comments here become the text and sections of your style guide. So the drop caps are in section 2.2 here, and I've provided markup for KSS to use. And then I parse the code and end up with something like this. Now, KSS is just the syntax here. It doesn't actually do the parsing or build the style guide pages. For that, you'll need another tool like SC5 Style Guide, which can generate the style guide itself from your KSS notation and tie into your build system. CSS parsers are a little bit more alive because you can see the snippets as you're actually working on the CSS code that corresponds to the snippet. But ultimately, you are still maintaining two code bases, and you still have to manually write that markup. So for a truly living style guide, you want something that's a bit more component-driven. And thanks to more component-driven front-end practices, there are tools that are cropping up that make this easier. So this is Catalog, which is a JavaScript tool that basically pulls in markdown files as individual components. It is technically platform agnostic, but it's really easy to integrate with React, so you can pull in your components directly. It's still a bit manual, though, because you do need to specify and import each individual component. So if you're using a tool like React, you may want to look at something like Style Guidist, which actually looks at your project's existing components and tries to pull them in automatically. Now, the tools for React can do some really neat things. So you can have live components that actually respond to user input and can change their state within your style guide, which I personally think is a compelling reason to switch to React. You also have style guide platforms, which are probably the most complex of the available style guide tools. Things like Fractal, Pattern Lab, Source.js. And they sort of require rethinking how you build a site, because you definitely have to start with the style guide as a toolkit. You basically use the components that the style guide platform provides you to actually build up your site. It gets a bit technical, but it could be worth investigating if you're working on something really complicated and want to spend a lot of time focusing on a design system. The bottom line is you want to find something that fits with your workflow and your project's demands. The more complex the project, the more complex a solution you may need. But a simpler project might warrant simpler tools. Now, I might not be able to tell you the perfect style guide tool for you, but I can tell you what helped me finally sort out my color problem. This is what my style guides tend to look like. Big swatches of color, and all my colors are set as SCSS variables. So I start with some neutral base colors, and then I add a primary color in 3 different tints, and then I add an accent color or 2. And this gives me a good palette to choose from, and I don't use any other colors. Now, my original approach was to set the primary color, the green, and just use Sass's darken and lighten function to get those tints and shades. Super easy. But if you do that, and if you look at it all in a scale like this, you can see it's not quite right. The lighter tints are too saturated. They look like they have too much color. But the darker shades don't feel saturated enough. And this is because of how color works. We think of color as this abstract, fluffy thing, but it's really just numbers. So you're probably familiar with using hex codes for colors, and probably RGB as well. Color can be represented in a number of different numerical ways using different color models. So RGB, CMYK, and we also have HSB, which you'll probably recognize if you spent any time in Photoshop or Sketch. According to HSB, a color is composed of hue, the actual color part of color, saturation, how much of that hue is in the color, and the brightness, how dark or light it is. So if we go back to our scale here, we've only adjusted the brightness of the color. So we need to adjust saturation as well so it feels harmonious. Less saturation for the lighter tints and more for the darker shades. So this is kind of better. It feels a bit more balanced, but it also kind of looks weird, and some of the colors are changing. Some of them look kind of blue. So the color change that's happening means that maybe we need to look at hue. And hue is the last thing left that we haven't changed. We've changed saturation, we've changed brightness. Hue, we represent as a 360-degree circle. Red is at 0, green is at 120, and blue is at 240. And these are our primary colors of light. Our secondary colors sit in between, yellow, cyan, and magenta. Now, if you look at these colors, you can see that some of them seem brighter than others. And this is because colors have a perceived brightness, or luminosity, which means that different hues feel brighter than others. So yellow here feels a lot lighter than a blue. So when we adjust saturation and brightness, we also need to adjust hue to account for those changes in order to get our color just right. And the rule for that is like this. To make a darker shade, we shift towards the closest primary color. Red at 0, green at 120, and blue at 240. So if I have an original color at 144, my closest primary is green at 120, and I shift the hue down a bit, and I end up at 130. To go lighter, you do the opposite. You shift the hue towards the secondary colors. Yellow at 60, cyan at 180, and magenta at 300. You can see these colors have so much more brightness to them. I actually had to put black text on them so that the text would be readable. So again, if our original color is 144, our closest secondary is cyan at 180, we shift the hue up a bit and end up at 150. And when we do that all the way up and down this scale, we go from this to this. And depending on where you are looking, that may not even seem like a visible difference, but it's actually a big improvement. Because when we apply these techniques to the original color palette, instead of this, we end up with this. And this technique has allowed me to build better, more harmonious, more nuanced palettes for my sites, and has ultimately led to my feeling more confident about my color choices. And I owe that all to style guides, because I never would have figured out that things weren't working if it weren't for style guides allowing me to see everything on one page. So that's one monster down. Next up, JavaScript.